Okay, so in this video, I'm just going to make a few comments about truth tables. Make sure we're all okay writing truth tables. It's a fundamental skill that you want to have. Most of our truth tables, or a lot of our truth tables anyway, are going to involve only two constituent propositions, usually P and Q. And so when you make a truth table and you involve only two constituent propositions, I mean, the first thing to think about is how many rows are going to show up in your table. Well, P can take on only two values. Just like any other proposition that we talk about, it's true or false. And Q can take on two values. It's also either true or false. Right? So one way to think about this is that for each of the two values that P can take on, Q can take on two values. Right? And so there's going to be 2 squared, or 2 times 2 rows in the truth table. Right? And so when you make the truth table, you're going to have 4 rows, and you just have to work through all of the possible combinations, right? So if you think about, there's 2 possibilities here. So the way I usually think about it is, let's get the first possibility for P, which is true, or you could start with false if you want. So the first possibility for P is true, and there's got to be 2 possibilities for Q that go with this first possibility for P. So to match true, well, let's do it. Let's do it this way. To match true for P, I can have true or false for Q. Right now, let's go to the other possibility for P, and then I can have the same 2 possibilities for Q. Right, so there were, right, here's one possibility for P that matches with the 2 possibilities for Q. Right, and then here's the second possibility for P that matches with the same 2 possibilities for Q. Right, so we could use the same thinking if we had P, Q, and R. Right, there's 2 possibilities here, and for each of those, there's 2 possibilities here, and for each of those, there's 2 possibilities here. So there's going to be 2 times 2 times 2, 2 cubed rows. Right, so there's going to be 8 rows in your truth table. There's going to be 8 rows in your truth table. So let's see. You might run through first all of the possibilities for P. Kind of like over here in this truth table, right? There was, well, let's just see. There's P is true. And then, okay, so if I know that P is true, then I'm looking at only the possibilities for Q and R, right? So once I know that P is true, I'm just thinking, well, how many different combinations are there for Q and R? Well, that kind of goes back to a truth table that has just 2 values. Here's the 4 possibilities, right? So for these 2, it can be TT, TF, FT, FF. Those are the possible ways to combine 2 propositions. We did that here, right? And so for any of these 4 combinations of Q and R, we could have P be true. Right, and then I could run through the same 4 different possibilities for Q and R where P was false, because that would be, right, those would be different because P would be false and I just run through these 4 possibilities for Q and R again. So what? TT, TF, FT, FF. Okay, and that's about as big of a truth table as we would ever want to write out. If we did have 4 constituent propositions, P, Q, R, and maybe S or whatever, there would be 2 for P, 2 for Q, 2 for R, 2 for S, so that's 2 to the 4th, or 16 rows. Now that's going to get pretty nasty to write out. You could certainly do it, but it wouldn't be very fun. So I think having 8 rows is the most we would ever practically want to do by hand. But we know there would be 16 rows if we had 4 propositions. So let's take a proposition that's got 3 constituent propositions, P, Q, and R, and let's write out the truth table. So when you do this, since you know that there's 3 constituent propositions, P, Q, and R, you're going to have 8 rows in your truth table, and we just drew those out in the page above. And you do this a couple times, you kind of just memorize it, maybe. And of course it doesn't matter what order you put the rows in, they could be in any order. That's the order that makes sense to me. You can do whatever makes sense to you. And then the way I recommend that you do this is just you want to break this guy up into smaller propositions. So let's look at P or Q in one column, and then we'll look at P and R in another column, and then we can put it all together. We can put it all together and build this guy. Oops, let's see. This should be OR. That will make a difference. Okay, so let's run down this column for P or Q. Right, so that means I'm focusing on this column and this column. So remember, the OR statement is true if either of these two are true. Right, so running down these 2 columns, if either of the 2 is true, then this statement will be true. And that's going to happen everywhere except my last 2 rows, because they're both false in those last 2 rows. Okay, then I'm going to look at P and R. So I'm looking at this column and this column. Now P and R is only true when both of those are true. So I've got true, true, makes that true, true, false, so false, true, true, so true, true, false, 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 true, false, 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 true, and false, false. So that one's not true very often, because both of the constituents P and R have to be true. Okay, and then finally I can put this one together. Ultimately this is an AND statement. Okay, so I've got P or Q in this row, P and R in this row, so the statement that I'm looking at will be true only if both this guy and this guy are true. So in the first row, they're both true. Second row, one is false. Third row, both true. Fourth row, one is false. And let's see, the rest of the way I have at least one that's false. So it's going to be false, 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 false. Okay. Sorry, I paused there for just a second because I was looking at what I had written down, and what I had written down on my paper was a little bit different than on the screen, but I think what I've got on the screen here is correct. So, you can do these however you want. You don't have to write this column or this column. But I think it certainly helps if you do. So hopefully that helps you in building your truth tables.